May 1943. A troop train crosses into Texas, carrying 499 men who can't believe what they're seeing through the windows. 20-year-old Feldwebel Werner Hartmann hasn't slept in 3 days, not since boarding at Camp Shanks in New York. Not since beginning to understand that everything he'd been told was a lie. Mile after mile of America scrolls past like a film reel. But this isn't the America Joseph Goebbels described in his broadcasts. This isn't the mongrel wasteland, the decadent circus of gangsters and weaklings that Nazi propaganda promised. The train slows at Amarillo Station, and through the dust-hazed platform, Hartmann sees him, a real cowboy. Not a propaganda poster, not a Hollywood caricature, but an actual American rancher in leather chaps and a wide-brimmed hat, rolling a cigarette, squinting into the desert sun with the casual confidence of a man who owns the horizon. Hartmann presses his face against the glass. 499 other German prisoners of war do the same, their breath fogging the windows as they stare at this impossible figure. This man who shouldn't exist according to everything they'd been taught. They were Afrika Korps, Rommel's men, the elite of the Wehrmacht. They'd been captured at Kasserine Pass, at Tunis, at Sicily. Soldiers who'd expected to die in one desert, but found themselves prisoners in another. Different continent, different outcome, different truth entirely. The Nazi propaganda machine had been very specific about American captivity. Expect barbarism, they were told. Expect torture. These uncultured mongrels of the New World will treat you worse than animals. After all, Americans were soft, decadent, a nation of mixed races without culture, without discipline, without honor. Cowboys and gangsters playing at being a country. That's what Goebbels said. They would crumble at the first sign of real German strength. But the first shock had come aboard the transport ships, before they ever saw Texas. White bread, real coffee, 3 hot meals daily, the same rations American soldiers received as mandated by the Geneva Convention. More food than German soldiers had seen in months, maybe years. Some prisoners ate until they were sick, their bodies unaccustomed to such abundance. They whispered among themselves at night, confused and frightened by this generosity. Was it a trick? Some elaborate psychological operation? Why would the enemy feed them better than their own army had? Now, through the Texas landscape, the contradictions multiplied with every passing mile. Endless farmland stretched to vanishing points on the horizon. Herds of cattle numbered in the thousands, more livestock than entire German provinces possessed. Oil derricks pumped black gold from the earth, their rhythmic motion speaking of wealth beyond comprehension. Towns appeared with electric lights burning bright even in daylight. Paved roads stretching in every direction. Automobiles everywhere, not just for officers or the wealthy, but ordinary Americans driving to work, to shops, to visit neighbors. One prisoner would later write home, his hand trembling as he tried to find words that wouldn't sound like fantasy. The Americans have so much of everything they even share it with their enemies. I don't know how to explain this to you, Mother. I don't know how to make you believe what I'm seeing. He couldn't explain it, couldn't find language for the cognitive dissonance of being treated humanely by people his government had called subhuman. How could he describe to his starving family the abundance that surrounded him? They wouldn't believe him. The censors wouldn't let it through anyway. So he wrote carefully, coding his amazement in simple sentences that barely scratched the surface of what he was experiencing. June 3rd, 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas, 30 miles northwest of Houston, built to house 4,800 prisoners. And what they found was essentially a small American town, dropped into the middle of cotton country. The buses rolled through the main gate, and the Germans braced themselves for machine gun towers, attack dogs, brutal guards wielding clubs and hatred. Instead, they discovered barracks with electricity and indoor plumbing, hot showers that actually worked, flush toilets, amenities many of them had never experienced even in Germany. recreation facilities with sports equipment and musical instruments, a canteen stocked with goods they could purchase with their wages. The camp commander addressed them through a translator, his voice firm but not cruel, laying out rules that seemed impossibly reasonable. "The rules are simple," he said. "Work 8 hours daily, follow regulations, 'cause no trouble. In return, 3 substantial meals, wages of 80 cents per day in camp script, canteen privileges, recreation, mail from home." The translator's voice carried across the assembled prisoners, and Unteroffizier Friedrich Becker felt his knees go weak. Wages? They were going to pay prisoners? The same 80-cent daily rate that American privates earned? This had to be a trick, some elaborate psychological operation designed to lower their guard before the real torture began. It wasn't a trick. The next morning, they met their work supervisors, and again reality defied expectation. These weren't soldiers. They were ranchers, cotton farmers, cattlemen, men in worn denim and leather boots who needed hands for the harvest. The American agricultural system was feeding half the free world, but American boys were fighting in Italy, preparing for the invasion of France, and Texas cotton fields stretched for thousands of acres. Without workers, the crops would rot in the fields. The Germans were the answer to every farmer's prayer, enemy or not. Rancher John Davidson looked over the group of prisoners, his weathered face showing neither hatred nor fear, just the practical assessment of a man who needed 40 hands for his cotton fields. He pointed at the biggest, strongest Germans, the ones who looked like they could handle the brutal work ahead. Then he did something that stopped everyone cold, something that would echo through the decades in the memories of every man present. He walked over, extended his calloused hand, and introduced himself. "In Texas," he explained through a translator, though his gesture needed no translation, "men shake hands before working together. It's a matter of respect." Oberfeldwebel Wilhelm Müller stared at the extended hand like it was a grenade with the pin pulled. 6 months ago, maybe less, he was fighting Americans in Tunisia, watching his friends die under American artillery, firing his own weapon at men in American uniforms. Now one of those Americans wanted to shake his hand, not as captor to prisoner, not as victor to vanquished, but as one working man to another, like equals. The concept was so foreign, so utterly at odds with everything he'd been taught about racial hierarchy and the natural order of superior and inferior peoples, that for a moment he couldn't move. Then, slowly, he took Davidson's hand. The grip was firm, honest, calloused from years of hard work. A working man's hand that knew the weight of tools and the resistance of the earth. The cotton fields of Brazos County stretched under the Texas sun like a white ocean, and the work was brutal in ways that combat never was. Bent backs that screamed in protest, bleeding fingers that couldn't grip anymore, 100-pound sacks that felt like they weighed 1,000 by day's end. The sun beating down like divine judgment on men who'd traded the certainty of war for the grinding reality of agricultural labor. But something extraordinary happened in those fields, something that would shatter the foundations of Nazi ideology more effectively than any propaganda film or re-education program. The German prisoners worked alongside Mexican migrant workers whose families had been picking cotton for generations, alongside black sharecroppers whose ancestors had worked these same fields in chains, alongside poor white tenant farmers who'd never owned the land they tended. The racial hierarchy the Nazis had preached, the master race doctrine that had been hammered into their heads since childhood, crumbled under the Texas sun like old clay. Everyone sweated the same. Everyone's back ached the same. Everyone drank from the same water bucket, and nobody cared about the color of the hands that passed it. At noon, when the sun was at its highest and cruelest, Rosa Martinez rang the dinner bell, and the prisoners expected bread and water. Maybe thin soup if they were lucky, the bare minimum required by international law. Instead, they got beef stew, thick with meat and vegetables. cornbread still warm from the oven, sweet tea cold enough to make their teeth ache, apple pie for dessert that tasted like every memory of home they'd ever had. Rosa didn't speak German and the prisoners didn't speak Spanish, but she ladled extra portions onto their plates and smiled. And food is a universal language that needs no translation. Werner Hartmann would remember this meal for the rest of his life, not because of the food, though it was better than anything he'd eaten in 2 years of military service, but because a Mexican woman treated German prisoners with the same kindness she showed everyone else. No calculation, no propaganda, no ideology, just simple human decency extended to hungry men who'd worked hard in her fields. The Third Reich said this was impossible. The Third Reich said that inferior races would always hate the master race, that only force and fear could maintain order in a racially mixed society. The Third Reich was wrong, and Rosa Martinez proved it wrong with every smile, every extra ladle of stew, every moment of uncomplicated kindness. Up at Camp McLean near Amarillo, the cowboys weren't metaphorical or symbolic. They were real working ranch hands, and they needed help with thousands of head of cattle spread across more land than some European countries. Rancher Thomas Anderson surveyed his new workers with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Luftwaffe pilots who'd never touched dirt, panzer crews who understood engines but not animals, U-boat sailors who'd spent the war in steel coffins under the ocean. Not one of them had ever seen a cow up close, much less knew how to work with one. He sighed deeply, pushed his hat back, and prepared for what he knew would be an interesting few months. "All right, boys," he said, though he knew they didn't understand English yet. "Let's start with the basics." He taught them how to approach a horse without getting kicked, how to read an animal's body language and respect its space. He showed them how to hold a rope, how to let it slide through your hands just right, so you could control it without burning your palms. He demonstrated how not to get trampled by a 1,000-pound steer that didn't want to go where you were trying to make it go. The Germans were terrified of the animals at first, these huge creatures with minds of their own and hooves that could crush bones. The animals were equally suspicious of the Germans, smelling their fear and uncertainty. It was mutual distrust at first sight, and Anderson had to resist the urge to laugh at grown men, combat veterans who'd faced death in the desert, backing away from a horse like it was a panzer. But Anderson was patient in a way that came from decades of working with animals and understanding that fear was natural and could be overcome with time and gentle teaching. His own son was somewhere over Germany right now, flying B-17s through flak and fighters, and these boys in front of him were someone's sons too. Enemy or not, Nazi or not, they were here, and they were human. And cattle don't care about politics or ideology. They just need to be tended, and he needed hands to tend them. Within weeks, something magical happened that Anderson would tell his grandchildren about years later. The Germans took to ranching like they were born to it, like their ancestors had been working cattle for generations, instead of being European city boys and farm laborers. Maybe it was their military discipline, the habit of following orders precisely and working as a coordinated unit. Maybe it was their engineering minds appreciating the logistics of moving large numbers of animals across vast distances, seeing it as a problem to be solved rather than just work to be done. Maybe it was just that working with animals is honest in a way that war never was, that a cow doesn't lie to you or betray you or ask you to compromise your humanity. Hauptmann Erich Schmidt became Anderson's best horseman within 2 months, could rope and brand and doctor cattle with the best of the ranch hands who'd been doing this work since they were children. At night, after the work was done and his muscles ached with that good tired that comes from honest labor, he sketched the landscape in a notebook he'd bought at the canteen. Mesas at sunset, the light turning the rocks gold and purple. Longhorns silhouetted against the view. Sky, their massive horns spanning wider than a man's outstretched arms. Cowboys and Germans working side by side, indistinguishable in the dust and sweat and shared purpose. Images that would be impossible anywhere else in the world. Scenes that contradicted everything both sides had been taught about each other. But Camp Hearn, for all its seeming normalcy, harbored a darkness that American officials were slow to recognize and powerless to fully control. Not all prisoners welcomed American kindness or saw it as anything other than weakness to be exploited. Hardcore Nazi loyalists, true believers in the Reich who would rather die than admit their ideology was bankrupt, maintained control through intimidation and violence. They held secret disciplinary hearings in the barracks at night, judging fellow prisoners for the crime of being too friendly with Americans, too willing to accept that the enemy might be human. They published an underground newsletter called Die Mahnung, the admonition, spreading propaganda about Germany's imminent victory and the terrible revenge that awaited collaborators. Most sinister of all, they infiltrated the camp's postal service, and this was no small thing because Camp Hearn served as the central POW mail distribution center for all German prisoners in the entire United States. Every letter sent to or from any of the 425,000 German POWs passed through Camp Hearn at some point, and the Nazi sympathizers who worked in the postal unit used this position to censor anti-Nazi prisoner mail, to send illegal messages to other camps, to track disloyal Germans across every camp in America and compile lists of men who would face consequences after the war, after Germany won, because they still believed Germany would win. December 17, 1943, and Corporal Hugo Kraus was sleeping in his barracks like any other night, except it wasn't any other night, and he would never wake up. Kraus was German-born, but his family had immigrated to the United States when he was just 9 years old, young enough to become more American than German, to speak English with a Brooklyn accent that made the guards smile and the other prisoners suspicious. He'd returned to Germany in 1939 as a young adult, gotten swept up in the fervor and the uniforms and the promises of glory, been conscripted into Rommel's Afrika Korps, and found himself, through the strange circuitous route that war creates, imprisoned right back in the country where he'd grown up. The Americans made him an interpreter because he spoke perfect English and could bridge the gap between the prisoners and their captors. But Kraus made a fatal mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake at all. Maybe it was a choice, a conscious decision to stand for truth, even when truth was dangerous. He was openly critical of the Third Reich. He reported clandestine activity to American guards. He told fellow prisoners in German and English, loudly and repeatedly, "America is winning this war. Germany is losing. Wake up and see the truth." The Nazi hardliners couldn't allow this, couldn't permit such open defiance to spread through the camp like a virus of reason infecting the body of true belief. That night, 6 to 10 prisoners, the exact number was never definitively established, broke into his barracks armed with clubs they'd fashioned from wood, boards studded with 4-inch nails they'd stolen and hidden, lead pipes they'd somehow acquired. They beat Hugo Kraus with systematic brutality, not in rage but with cold purpose, beating him until his skull fractured and his brain began to swell, until he died from cerebral concussion and massive head trauma, until he became a message written in blood to anyone else who might think about cooperating with the Americans. Hugo Kraus was one of only 5 prisoners killed by fellow POWs in American camps during the entire war, a remarkably low number that spoke to the general success of the program, but also a number that meant 5 men died not in combat, but at the hands of their own countrymen, murdered for the crime of seeing their enemies as human. His attackers were eventually identified, brought to trial in early 1946, and sentenced to life in prison, though they were repatriated to Germany in 1949 as part of the general prisoner return. And what happened to them after that, whether they faced any justice in the ruins of post-war Germany, remains unknown. The murder revealed what American officials should have known, what some of them did know but felt powerless to prevent, that some prisoners brought the Reich with them. Even behind Texas barbed wire, that ideology can survive defeat and captivity. The true believers will enforce their beliefs with violence if given the opportunity. It was a sobering reminder that not every story had a happy ending, that transformation wasn't universal, that some men would rather kill than change their minds. But hundreds of miles away in Arizona, on December 23, 1944, a different kind of resistance was taking shape, one that was almost comical in its ambition and tragic in its execution. 25 U-boat sailors at Camp Papago Park had been digging for 3 months, working in shifts during the night, moving dirt a handful at a time, creating a tunnel that stretched 178 feet beyond the fence. Tonight they would escape, would taste freedom for the first time in months or years, would execute a plan so brilliant in conception and so stupid in execution that it would become legend. The plan was simple. Float down the Salt River to the Gila River, then to the Colorado River, and finally to the Gulf of California and freedom in Mexico. Live free until Germany won the war, because some of them still believed Germany could win, still believed the propaganda about wonder weapons and inevitable victory. They'd built a collapsible boat from scraps of wood and rubber, studied maps that showed a clear water route to freedom, saved food and supplies for the journey. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. Everything was about to go catastrophically wrong. Kapitän Leutnant Hans-Werner Krauss led them out at 9 p.m., and by 2:30 in the morning, all 25 were through the tunnel, emerging into the cool Arizona night under a full moon that seemed like a blessing, like Providence smiling on their audacity. Freedom. Real freedom after months of captivity. Even if that captivity had been comfortable, even if they'd been treated well, it was still captivity, and now they were free. They ran toward the river, hearts pounding, adrenaline singing in their veins, already imagining the feel of water carrying them toward Mexico and liberty. And they stopped. The Salt River was dry, bone dry, not a drop of water, just sand and rocks, and the desert stretching away in every direction, hostile and vast, and utterly indifferent to their plans. Their maps were from 1880, from before the dams were built, before irrigation changed the hydrology of the entire region, before the American capacity for engineering reshaped the landscape itself. Their boat was useless. Their plan was dead. They stood there in the moonlight, 25 men who'd just escaped from a POW camp, staring at a dry riverbed and realizing they'd made a terrible mistake. They scattered into the Arizona desert, breaking into small groups, avoiding trains and buses because they had no papers and no good explanation for who they were or where they were going. The desert was merciless in ways they hadn't anticipated, freezing at night when the temperature dropped 40 degrees, burning during the day when the sun turned the ground into a griddle. No water anywhere, no real food, no idea where they were or how far they'd have to walk to reach anywhere that mattered. Within days they started returning, some captured by search parties, others surrendering on their own because the desert was killing them more efficiently than any prison camp ever could. Unteroffizier Johann Kramer stumbled into a gas station near Phoenix after 3 days of freedom, sunburned so badly his skin was blistering, dehydrated to the point of hallucination, his lips cracked and bleeding, barely able to stand. The attendant was an old man named Pete, weathered and kind in that way that some old men are, and he looked at this German prisoner who'd somehow ended up at his gas station and saw not an enemy, but a human being in need. He gave Kramer water, cold and clean, and more precious than gold. He made him a sandwich, actual food, and sat with him while they waited for the authorities. Pete shared his coffee and told Kramer about his own son fighting somewhere in the Pacific, and they sat there, two father's sons, one lost in the Arizona desert and one lost in a war half a world away, finding brief connection in shared humanity. The most telling detail about the whole escape came from one of the recaptured prisoners who admitted, shamefaced, that he'd seen the camp's planned Christmas menu, the feast they were preparing for the holiday, and he'd turned himself in immediately because the meal was too good to miss. Ham and turkey, real vegetables, pie, all the trimmings of an American Christmas. Better food than he'd eat in Germany, even if Germany still existed when he got home. All 25 escapees were eventually recaptured, the last ones taken into custody weeks after the escape, and their punishment was bread and water rations for as many days as they'd been absent from camp. That's it. No beatings, no torture, no execution, just missing some meals. In Nazi Germany, attempted escape from a POW camp meant execution, no trial, no appeal, just a bullet in the back of the head and a shallow grave. Here in America, it meant going hungry for a while and then returning to the same comfortable captivity they'd left. The contrast wasn't lost on the prisoners. This fundamental difference in how the two sides treated their captives, what it said about values and civilization, and which country truly respected human dignity. Meanwhile, back in the camps, prisoners struggled with what to write home, how to describe their experience to families who were suffering in ways they could barely imagine. Friedrich Becker sat in his barracks at Camp Herren with paper and pen, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like lies or propaganda, trying to explain the inexplicable to his wife back in Hamburg. "The Americans are not what we were told," he wrote, his handwriting careful and precise. "They have given us warm clothes and good boots. We eat meat every day. I am saving my wages. When I come home, we will have money to start over." He didn't mention the abundance that surrounded him, couldn't find words for it that she would believe. The cars that every farmer owned, not just one car for the whole village, but individual cars for individual families. The electric lights that burned all night, not rationed or conserved, but used freely as if electricity cost nothing. The stores packed with goods, shelf after shelf of food and clothing and luxuries that didn't exist in Germany anymore, if they ever had. How could he describe this to a woman standing in ration lines, to a family that hadn't seen meat in months, to a city being bombed to rubble night after night? He couldn't, so he wrote carefully, coding his amazement in simple sentences, knowing the censors on both sides would read his words, and knowing his wife would read between the lines if she was smart. If she remembered that he'd always been truthful with her, that if he said things were good here, it was because they genuinely were, impossibly, inexplicably good. Some things couldn't be hidden, though. The prisoners were gaining weight, filling out, getting healthy for the first time in years. They were learning trades, real skills they could use after the war. Some of them were even happy, and that was perhaps the most subversive thing of all, that enemy prisoners could find happiness in captivity, could experience more freedom and prosperity as POWs in America than they'd ever known as soldiers in the Third Reich. Spring 1945, and the war in Europe was ending in ways that nobody in the camps wanted to think about too carefully. In the barracks, listening to radios that were now legal, the prisoners heard about the fall of Berlin, the Russian advance, the complete collapse of everything they'd fought for. Letters from home stopped coming, and the prisoners knew what that meant, knew that the postal system had broken down, that cities were rubble, that families were scattered or dead or fled to who knows where. What was there to go back to? What home awaited them in the ruins of the Reich? Thomas Anderson made an offer to his German cowboys that he knew he shouldn't make, that he knew couldn't be accepted, but he made it anyway because these men had become more than just workers to him. He wished they could stay, he told them through translators who'd become friends, wished they could work the ranch permanently, make a life here in Texas, where there was land and opportunity and a future that didn't involve Soviet occupation or starvation or digging through rubble for remnants of a life that no longer existed. He'd sponsor them if he could, help them immigrate legally, pay them good wages, $100 a month plus room and board. More than they'd ever make in Germany if Germany still existed as a functional country. But the Geneva Convention was clear and inflexible on this point. Prisoners must be repatriated after hostilities end. No exceptions, no matter how much both sides might want to make exceptions. They had to go home, even if home was a concept more than a place now, even if home meant Soviet occupation and communist rule, and a divided country that would take 50 years to reunify. Ranchers across Texas and New Mexico and Arizona wrote letters to their congressmen, passionate letters arguing that these weren't just prisoners anymore. They were neighbors and friends, and the best workers they'd ever had. Men who'd proven themselves honest and hardworking and deserving of a chance at American citizenship. But the law was the law, and perhaps it was better that way. Perhaps it was necessary to maintain the framework of international agreements that made civilized warfare possible. If warfare could ever truly be called civilized, the prisoners would go home, back to whatever awaited them in the ruins of Europe, carrying with them memories of Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, memories of Americans who'd treated them with unexpected kindness, memories that would shape the rest of their lives in ways neither side could yet fully understand. May 8, 1945, VE Day, victory in Europe. Unabrintried, and the war was officially over. In Camp Hearn, the prisoners gathered around radios and listened in silence as the announcer described Germany's unconditional surrender, the complete and total defeat of the Third Reich, the end of everything they'd been told would last 1,000 years. 12 years. That's how long the 1,000-year Reich lasted. 12 years of blood and ideology, and promises of glory. And now it was ash. All of it, reduced to rubble and mass graves, and a shame that would haunt the German people for generations. Everything they'd fought for was gone. Every promise they'd believed was revealed as a lie. Every sacrifice was rendered meaningless by total defeat. They sat in their American barracks, well-fed and healthy and alive, and tried to process what this meant, what came next, who they were now that the Reich was dead, and they were prisoners in a foreign land that had treated them better than their own country ever had. That night, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable just years before, John Davidson brought a bottle of whiskey to the camp, good bourbon from before the war. Expensive stuff he'd been saving for a special occasion. He shared it with Wilhelm Müller and the Germans who'd worked his fields for 2 years, men who'd become familiar, become almost friends, despite the barriers of language and nationality and the recent history of violent conflict between their countries. They sat together in the Texas evening and drank to the end of the war, to the dead on all sides, to friends and enemies and everyone caught in between, to whatever came next in a world that felt both terrifying and full of unexpected possibility. Müller told him, speaking English now with barely a trace of accent, his fluency earned through 2 years of daily practice, that he wanted to come back when he could, if American law would allow it, if there was any way to return to this strange country that had shown him kindness when he expected only hatred. America had shown him something Germany never did, something that struck at the heart of everything he'd been taught about power and strength and the natural order of things. That strength doesn't require cruelty. That power doesn't demand hatred. That enemies can become friends over cotton fields and cattle drives, over shared work and shared meals, and the simple human recognition that we're all just trying to survive and maybe, if we're lucky, find some meaning and dignity in the process. The repatriation began in 1946, a massive logistics operation to return hundreds of thousands of prisoners to a Europe that barely existed anymore. The trains reversed their journey, rolling east instead of west, carrying men back toward an uncertain future. East to the ports where ships waited, ships that would carry them across the Atlantic to a continent they barely recognized, back to a nation that had been bombed and burned and divided, back to cities that were rubble and roads that led nowhere, and a future that promised nothing but hard years of rebuilding. But the Germans carried something with them, something more valuable than any physical possession, something that couldn't be taken away or destroyed. Knowledge. Not military secrets or strategic intelligence, but something more fundamental and potentially more powerful. They knew how Americans farmed, how they organized their labor and their resources, how they worked together across racial and class lines to achieve common goals. They'd seen American abundance up close and understood it wasn't magic or natural resources or even industrial capacity, though those things mattered. It was methods, machinery, management, organization, the thousand small efficiencies that added up to a society that could feed itself and half the world besides. More importantly, more fundamentally, they knew Americans as human beings, not as propaganda caricatures or ideological abstractions. They knew Thomas Anderson, who'd taught them to ride horses with patient kindness despite having a son risking his life over German cities. They knew Rosa Martinez, who'd ladled extra stew onto their plates and smiled at them like they were worth smiling at. They knew John Davidson, who'd shaken their hands like men shake hands when they respect each other, regardless of nationality or recent history. They knew Pete, who'd given water to an escaped prisoner and seen not an enemy to be punished, but a human being in need of help. When they told these stories back in Germany, nobody believed them at first. Americans treating prisoners better than Germany treated its own soldiers? Impossible, absurd, obvious propaganda designed to make the defeat seem less shameful. Paying them wages, teaching them skills, sharing their churches and their Christmas dinners? Fantasy, wishful thinking, stories made up to cope with the trauma of captivity and defeat. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. 425,000 German POWs had worked American farms from 1943 to 1946. They'd harvested millions of dollars worth of crops, picked cotton by the ton, saved entire harvests that would have rotted in the fields without their labor. The American agricultural miracle that fed the Allied war effort, German prisoners helped make it possible, helped sustain the very system that was defeating their homeland. And then something remarkable happened, something that spoke to the fundamental power of human connection to transcend even the most bitter conflicts. By 1950, American immigration laws changed, and former prisoners of war were allowed to apply for entry to the United States as regular immigrants, no longer as enemies or captives, but as people seeking a new life in a new land. They came, thousands of them, boarding ships in Hamburg and Bremen, in ports they'd left years before as prisoners and now returned to as free men making a choice, choosing America not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because they'd seen what America could offer, and they wanted to be part of it. Werner Hartmann, former Afrika Korps sergeant who'd pressed his face against that train window in 1943 and seen his first real cowboy, returned to Texas in 1951. John Davidson was waiting at the station, same handshake, stronger grip, years older but fundamentally unchanged. No translator needed now. Hartmann's English was perfect, carrying that distinctive Texas accent that marked him as one of their own, sounding like a cowboy himself when he spoke. He married a local girl, a woman who knew his story and didn't care, who saw not a former enemy but a good man trying to build a life. He opened a machine shop in town, fixed tractors and farm equipment, became known as the best mechanic in the county, someone you could trust to do the job right and charge a fair price. His son went to Texas A&M and studied agriculture, became the kind of farmer his father had worked for as a prisoner, modern and efficient and successful. His grandson wore an American uniform, served in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne, jumped out of planes, and fought in mountains half a world away from the Texas cotton fields where his grandfather had learned that enemies could become friends. The transformation was complete, from Wehrmacht sergeant to American grandfather, from enemy combatant to respected community member, from Nazi soldier to the ancestor of an American paratrooper. 3 generations, and the war became history, became family stories told over Sunday dinner, became part of the complex tapestry of American immigration that includes everyone from every conflict, everyone seeking a better life. Another former prisoner returned to Arizona, to the ranch lands where Thomas Anderson still worked cattle despite his advancing years. Anderson had work waiting, had been saving a spot for the best horseman he'd ever trained, German or American or anything else. The man worked hard, saved his money with the discipline he'd learned in the military, and eventually bought his own ranch, 500 acres near Tucson, good land with water rights and grazing for horses. He raised quarter horses, beautiful animals that won prizes at state fairs, that people came from across the Southwest to buy because they knew the quality of his breeding program and the care he took with every animal. His neighbors knew his story, knew he'd been a German prisoner during the war, and they didn't care, didn't hold it against him or treat him differently because of a past he couldn't change and a war that was over. In Arizona, you're judged by how you work, not where you're from, not what you did before you came here, but by the quality of your labor and the content of your character, and whether you're the kind of neighbor who'll help during roundup or come running when there's trouble. Even one of the Papago Park escapees, one of the men who'd crawled through that tunnel and run toward a dry riverbed, thinking they'd float to freedom, returned to America legally in the 1950s. He settled in Phoenix, opened a small business not far from where he'd been recaptured. And the irony wasn't lost on him or anyone else who knew the story. He'd tried to escape from Arizona and failed, and now he'd chosen to come back to Arizona and succeeded at building a life in the very place that had once been his prison. The desert that had defeated his escape attempt became his home, and he learned to love it, learned to see beauty in the harsh landscape that had nearly killed him. Decades passed, and in the 1980s, former POWs began returning to visit the camps, bringing their children and grandchildren, wanting to show them where they'd spent the war, where their lives had changed in ways they were still discovering. They brought photo albums, yellowed and fragile, filled with images of young men in Wehrmacht uniforms learning to pick cotton, learning to rope cattle, learning that their enemies were human beings worthy of respect and dignity. At one reunion held at the site of what used to be Camp Hearn, an elderly rancher stood to speak, his voice weaker than it used to be, but his message as clear as it had ever been. "You boys came here as enemies," he said, and the room went quiet, everyone remembering those early days of mutual suspi.